Welcome to this video from the Consultants Development Institute. I'm Carter McNamara, an instructor with the Institute and the presenter in this video. Now let's talk about the outcomes that we're going to aim for to accomplish in this video. First is to polish your toolbox of major methods to use in consulting projects, regardless of your type of consulting. You will recognize which methods to use and when. You will also build on useful basics to use in each of those methods. And you'll also know when to switch between methods without confusing your clients. And last, you will get clear perspective on the methods or styles not to use, particularly when helping clients to solve complex problems or accomplish significant change. You'll do that by dispelling certain major myths about those methods and myths that many consultants and clients have. Some of them might have those myths about you. This video won't make you an expert in each of the primary methods, but I do want to help you form a firm foundation for further development in each method. So I'm providing handouts for each of the methods that include some basic best practices for doing the particular method. We'll touch on each of the handouts in this video. So now, let's get started. Whether you are a specialist or a generalist consultant or an internal or external consultant, you will use one or more of the following three major methods to help clients to solve their problems. You will advise them by giving expert advice to help them solve problems. The source of the advice is from the consultant, from you, of course, and not from the client. You will coach them to guide and support them to take actions and learn at the same time. In good coaching, the source of the information or the wisdom is from the client, and you will facilitate their group processes to guide and support the group to make progress and achieve results. In pure facilitation, the knowledge comes from the group members. However, it might also come from the consultant or facilitator at various times in the group, depending on the purpose of the group. You might even see these methods as roles in addition to being methods. Many people believe that there are other roles that consultants fill in a project, such as advocate or collaborator or mentor. However, it's common that those other roles still use these primary methods listed above. Some people might even suggest that training is another major method. However, training actually uses one or more of the above three primary methods and therefore is not a primary method in and of itself. So let's dive into what we're talking about, giving advice. Consultants give advice when they want to convey expert knowledge, that is, knowledge that most people would readily accept as true or would not question. And it's useful when the client needs general knowledge that is common to any consulting project, for example, to set up a financial management process or establish a specific model of quality management, such as Six Sigma or TQM, Total Quality Management. Specialist consultings do a great deal of advising. Another situation for an expert is when a project needs unique technical information right away in order to address a current challenge. For example, to fix a broken computer or even quickly conform to certain laws and regulations. Occasionally, though, a client might be feeling a bit of anxiety about a certain problem and want a consultant to provide a quick solution for now, even if just to reassure the client. While this is an example of when advice might be needed, the consultant should be careful that the client doesn't end up believing that all situations can merely be caused by giving advice. I'm going to share some basics about when to give advice and when it's best. Be sure, though, that when you give advice, you're always sure that you really know what the client really needs. Don't give advice just off the top of your head or be shooting from the hip, because sometimes you might be wrong. Many of us consultants who have strong expertise in a particular area want to share our expertise so badly that everywhere we look, we tend to find excuses to share that advice. So be careful. Be open to your clients also needing coaching or facilitating. We'll talk more about each of those soon. And before sharing advice, know what it is that you want to convey. Be sure that somewhere in your talking, you actually end up conveying the main points that you wanted to say. Your style depends on the style of the client. Some clients want to get straight to the point, while others want to understand your thinking as to how you came to the conclusions that you did, and then they want to hear your advice. Be sure the advice is even doable. Consider the range of resources and the capabilities your client has. Some clients might even be inspired by far-reaching and invigorating advice, but you could even hurt your consulting project and your credibility by giving advice that is far too unrealistic. When sharing advice, and especially when explaining advice, describe what you see or hear or what you suggest that others see or hear based on your advice. Focus on facts that your client can readily detect for themselves. Do not start diagnosing or judging people's personalities, no matter how much you're convinced that you're right. That only makes clients confused and, even worse, can make them feel defensive. And after you've shared your advice, you might ask your client to summarize back to you the highlights of what you said. Don't start by asking them to summarize back to you because you aren't sure they're really listening. Instead, frame your question as if it's your need that you are addressing. For example, say, I want to be sure that I'm being clear in my advice, so I'd appreciate if you could summarize what you're hearing from me. And after sharing your advice, it's often useful to help clients to learn even more about the reasons for your advice. That can add credibility to what you're saying and gain their appreciation for you being there to help them to learn. I'm going to share a quick tool that I do sometimes when I'm doing consulting, and people ask me about how they can give advice to others, or they ask about how is it that I'm even giving advice. So I'm pulling up a tool, and it's one of the handouts. If you downloaded the handout before this session, this is something that could be useful to you. I'm showing it to you now mostly to make sure that you've got it, and it reiterates a lot of what I had just said, sometimes adds a little bit more for it, but again, this is a tool that I'm hoping will be useful to you. So after talking about advice, it would be useful if we just paused for a bit, and I'm hoping that with peers that you're watching this with, or if you're just by yourself going through this, pause the video. You'll remember if you took the roles course earlier that there's a button in the bottom left-hand corner. Press on that button and pause the video, and then think about an answer to the question of how have you given advice in the past? And based on what you're hearing, is there any new guidelines that you will use? It's often useful to discuss that because you'll hear lots of different perspectives, but there's research that shows you tend to learn best when you're actually writing something down or making it conscious. So you'll get the most from these videos if you're actually using your learning journal that you got in your course. So we talked about advice. I'm going to talk now about just some basics about coaching, which is another major method, of course, but it's become very popular. The field of personal and professional coaching has quickly become mainstream for personal, professional, even organizational development, and there are many reasons for that. Perhaps foremost is that it brings out the inner wisdom of individuals and teams in a way that suits their own nature and needs. It seems there's been an explosion in the number of coaching schools and models. Perhaps common to all of them is that they see coaching as including at least the following 4 steps. Coaching focuses on a current situation for the client that could be a problem or even an exciting opportunity that they're working on. And it guides and supports the client to identify relevant and realistic actions to address the situation. It's very important that the actions be realistic, especially for people who already are overwhelmed with things to do. And coaching guides and supports the client to actually do those actions, perhaps even before the next coaching session. If the actions aren't taken, then the client explains what he or she did instead and why. But a hallmark of coaching is to guide and support the client to carefully reflect on or think about the results of those actions, especially to learn their effects on the life and work of the client. Coaches use a wide variety of tools, as you can see listed on this slide. I'm going to be quiet here for a second while you just take a look at these tools, and I hope that you might even recognize that some of them maybe you're actually using. In fact, sometimes when people talk about coaching, they tend to talk about it as something that is new and highly skilled. Many times coaches, in fact, one of their favorite tools is just asking useful questions. So take a look at those tools, and this is what, as a consultant, if you do coaching, you might fall back on. You might already notice where coaching could be very powerful for consultants to use with clients. For example, if the client seems stuck in going forward in a project, then the consultant can use coaching to help the client to identify how to examine the situation and what to actually do about it. Let's look at some guidelines about when to use coaching. I mentioned that it's very useful for bringing out actions and learning. And one hallmark of coaching really is thoughtful questions. A situation, for example, it's useful during implementation of plans to ensure accountability, that actions are actually taken, but again, that there's learning at the same time. A consultant might use it during a project when a client is troubled. Coaching helps the client to identify why he's nervous and what he can do to improve the situation. If the consultant notices that the client is not implementing plans as intended, as I mentioned, he could use coaching to help the client to even admit there's a delay and to realize the real cause for the delay. Coaching could help the client commit to getting back on schedule. It's also very useful to maximize the client's learning during projects. Projects usually include many different types of activities and relationships. Each of these can be a rich learning lab if the client is helped to reflect on the activities and the relationships in order to identify new knowledge, skills, and insights. The consultant's questions help the client to do that. Consultants can even teach clients to use coaching themselves to sustain motivation and momentum among their own employees. For example, if employees aren't implementing plans on schedule, the client can coach employees to take ownership in that problem, to resolve it, and to learn at the same time. We're going to talk about some basics in coaching, but I want to be clear that what I'm talking about won't make you a certified coach. One of the first things that coaches do is ask useful questions, but they tend to avoid questions that have simple answers like yes or no, because that doesn't really cultivate thought, reflection, and learning. Also, sometimes if you ask the questions why, it just makes people a bit defensive. Another tool is paraphrasing. So for example, you might say to a client, if I could summarize what I'm hearing from you, or I want to be sure that I'm understanding you, so let me try to put what you're saying into my own words to be sure that I'm hearing you. You might also reframe what they're saying, and that can be extremely powerful in helping your client to see things differently, because when people get stuck, it's often in how they see things. It's rarely because they need some new procedure. For example, help them shift their thinking from the passive to the active. If they say, I just can't seem to get past this, then you might respond, well, what is one small step that you might take? Or help them shift from the future to the past. For example, if they say, I can't seem to get started on achieving this goal, then you might respond, has there been a time in the past when you achieved a goal? And if so, what did you do back then to be successful? How might you use that approach now? Or help them shift from others to themselves. For example, if they say, our employees just won't do that, then you might respond, well, what will you do yourself then? But always aim your coaching for relevant and realistic actions that they can take. Coaching is great for generating lots of new ideas. You want to help your client identify which ones are most realistic for them to do. If you have the opportunity, try to help the client to take time to reflect on the questions you're asking, on the results of the actions that they're taking. Coaching isn't just to solve problems. It's also to help people learn at the same time. And again, our advice here won't make you an expert in coaching. You can learn more by using some of the books on coaching that we suggest in the course's sources for additional learning. I have another handout that I want to share, and it's a basic handout, Basics About Coaching. It's got useful questions, though, that I've seen and used over the years. It's a handout that you've probably downloaded, or I hope you will. It's available from your course in the learning management system. It talks first about the traits of useful questions. It talks about even examples of questions that you might even ask. I encourage you to use something simple and basic like this and just practice. But again, I always want people to realize coaching is something that you're probably doing somewhat yourself. It isn't necessarily something that you have to get a certificate in, although that's really helpful to have that kind of certification. So we talked about advice, we talked about coaching. I'm hoping now you'll pause again, and those you're watching the video with, or even yourself, pull out your journal and reflect on what it is you heard about coaching, how that might be used for you. Is there anything you want to modify about that? Do you have any questions about when coaching can even best be applied? Simply pause the video and then come back again when you're done. So we're going to go on and talk about the third method, and that's facilitating. Most work and organization is done in teams. Facilitating is a very powerful method for consultants to work in teams. And the consultant, when they're facilitating, the pure definition of facilitating is really guiding and supporting a group to do what it is that the group wants to do. And there's different styles of facilitation. As you probably know, they range from directive to indirect. Situations in a project that might require the consultant to fill the facilitator role includes, for example, when you need to get the client's trust and participation, and you're not really sure that they're really committed, but you want to work kind of from them rather than at them. And facilitation is great for that. That kind of participation comes from their knowing that their beliefs and opinions are honored and valued. The hallmark of facilitation really is to bring out those beliefs and opinions and help members to use them to decide what they want to do and how they want to do it. And another use for facilitation is when a group needs to make a decision but struggles to do so, a good facilitator can help members to clarify the need for the decision, identify the best options they should consider, and then decide which option is best. And this is useful when helping clients to select which are your recommendations, for example, that they want to follow. Facilitation is always useful to help a group solve a complex problem, like when a situation requires a variety of perspectives and insights from members in order to fully understand the problem and what can be done to solve it. A good facilitator can bring out that variety of perspectives and opinions, and they'll help members to come to a consensus in what it is they want to do to solve the problem. So I'm going to share just some basic tips about good facilitation that I've learned over the years. Before facilitating, though, you should be sure that you've even designed the group for successful facilitation. And here's some suggestions. First, be sure that all the group members know the purpose for their even coming together. Or be sure to suggest a way that they can get clear on their purpose when they first come together. Are the right members in the group for achieving that purpose? How do you know? Be sure to come to the group with an approach to verify the right membership without any of them feeling they were somehow not useful in the group. Will each member feel that the group has a benefit for him or her? If not, it will be difficult to get each member's commitment and participation. Will the members accept you as the facilitator? Will they accept you as the person to guide and support them to achieve their purpose? And again, how do you know? What is the best style of facilitation for the group? Is it best to be more directive or less directive? And again, how do you know? How will you manage any conflict that might arise? Conflict isn't bad. It's how it's handled that can be a problem. And then how will the group make decisions and solve problems? Will they do it by consensus? Will they do it by voting? Different groups like to work differently, but it always depends on one thing, especially, and that's what's the purpose of the group in the first place. So I've got another handout, like before, that I'm hoping that you'll download and use. And it's a handout that I've used for many years. I've actually go through the check marks here, top down. Sometimes I'll have the client work with me to answer the questions. In fact, it's always best, I find, when you're trying to prepare how to work with a client, to really have one or two client members work with you. So the handout talks about the purpose of the group, talks about the membership of the group, facilitation, and so on. And again, that's available to you as part of this video. You can simply download it and then use it. But I want to talk about another portion of facilitation. Besides designing for facilitation, you also need to have just some good basic meeting management. And the first is to open the meeting effectively. For example, to start and stop on time. Ask if there's any key people missing. Do introductions if they're needed, clarify your role in the meeting, and model the kind of energy that you want others to have. Establish ground rules to reflect the kind of personality that you want the meeting to have, or that they want to have, which is even more important. For example, will there be full or spotted participation? Will people be punctual and down to business, or informal and chatty? Manage your time well. use a good agenda with timing per topic. And if that time is exceeded, then get the group's permission to add more time or move on. And evaluate the meeting as it's happening. Every hour or so, ask members how it's going in the meeting. Is the room okay? What do they think of the participation? Are they achieving the purpose? And so on. And evaluate the meeting at the end. Here's a process that I've used. In fact, it's often useful if you're having a meeting face-to-face. Ask each member just to write a number from 1 to 5. And 1 is kind of their gut feeling about the quality of the meeting being very poor. 5 is very good. And then the facilitator will call on each member of the group, one at a time, and have him or her show the rest of the members the number that he or she wrote down. But then explain, why did he pick that number? And what could he have done during the meeting that could have gotten a 5 for the meeting now? So an example would be, Tom would say, well, I'll give it a 4. I liked the ground rules and the participation, and the meeting was useful for me. I won't give it a 5 because the room is cold. Well, what Tom should have done then is when the room was cold, right away, he should have said something about that. So that's a technique I've seen to really pull out people's ownership and participation. But a part that's forgotten too much is to capture the learning from the meeting, and that's to ask members what new learning came out of the meeting. In fact, you might even define learning as new knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Consider having each person write down their learning before calling on them to share that. And then, of course, close the meeting. And it's useful to review actions and assignments, establish the time and location for the next meeting, mention who will be doing any minutes for the meeting and when. So that's an overview about facilitation. And another moment for pausing to reflect. Again, I don't want this video to be you're listening to my ideas and then suddenly they're gone by the end of the video. The way you can make them real is to really reflect on them. So you can pause the video, and when you come back, we're going to talk about how to switch between the roles of those 3 methods I talked about. So let's do that. We'll talk about switching between the roles. A good consultant might switch between various methods or roles in a project at different times, and it's very important that the client always knows which method that you're actually using. Otherwise, you could get the client confused, and when they become confused, you no longer have their ownership and their interest. So here are some guidelines that I've used in the past that are useful. First, you might even refer to the different methods as wearing a hat. So for example, when you're coaching, you would say, I'm going to put on my coaching hat now. Also, it helps to tell the client the source of the knowledge and where it's coming from. So for example, if you want to share advice, then you might mention, well, I've got some advice that I'd like to give to you. If you want to coach, then you could mention, let's do some coaching to understand your thoughts even more in this situation. And if you want to facilitate, then you could be clear on the purpose of the facilitating, but say too that I want to help to facilitate with the group to really pull out their wisdom. And depending on the situation, it might be that they actually want you to train some. The situation would be very much the same as what I talked about when it's appropriate to give advice, but you'd be doing that with the group. So with facilitating, it always depends on the purpose of the group. But a key point is don't fall in love with any one certain method. Sometimes new consultants often feel a strong need to show their expertise in order to maintain credibility, so they stay in the advising method. But similarly, consultants who have maybe strong interpersonal or supportive skills might resort to coaching a lot. And then again, consultants with strong group skills might prefer primarily to use facilitation. But highly effective consultants can switch between methods depending on the needs of the current situation rather than on their comfort levels. I'd like then now, since we've talked about the methods and when to switch, to dispel certain myths that people have about consulting. And these are myths that people have about the methods of consulting, myths that your client might even have about you. So as we go through each, you might think about whether you or your colleagues or your friends believe in some of the very same myths. But keep in mind that these myths and the truths that dispel them apply especially to consulting projects that intend to solve complex problems or accomplish significant change in organizations. The first one we'll talk about, I call it the myth that expertise equals action. And the myth is that many consultants and clients have the belief that the stronger their expertise, the more likely the clients will actually apply it. So as a result, these consultants are very authoritative in their dealings with their clients. Sometimes their clients greatly appreciate that rather parental approach until they realize that hearing the expertise is not the same thing as actually applying it. The truth is that, especially to solve a complex problem or achieve a major goal, the client needs ongoing guidance and support. The client's first attempts to solve the problem sometimes just produce more problems. So effective problem solving takes time and adjustment and learning. Clients need a consultant who offers expert advice, perhaps, but then also can offer ongoing coaching, facilitation to support that advice. Another myth, I call it the been there and done that myth. And the myth is that some clients who have never worked with consultants before, they'll seek consultants who have solved that exact same type of problem with that exact same type of organization. They've been there and they've done that. The client's belief is that those consultants are now the experts at that particular type of problem, so they're much more likely to quickly and permanently solve the client's problem. The truth is that organizations and cultures are highly unique, as are their problems and their solutions. One of the most important skills of consultants is to work with clients to really understand the characteristics of their organization and their particular problem, then to generate a solution that suits the nature and needs of its people. What a client thinks is the problem is often just a symptom of the real problem. So looking for a consultant who's been there and who's done that might just be looking for a consultant who can only deal with the symptoms and not the real causes. In the Savior consultant, the myth is that the consultant will somehow descend into the client's organization and make several quick changes and then leave, having fixed the organization's problems forever. Although these clients know better, they sometimes still act as if those kinds of savior consultants are really out there. Few, if any, consulting projects are that simple. It probably took a long time to create the problem in the client's organization, so it might take more than a quick fix to solve it too. Life teaches us that when we solve one problem, that often moves us along to the next one. Perhaps the goal isn't to expect a problem-free workplace, but to get better at solving each problem in it, and to make a bigger improvement each time. Perhaps it's the journey more than the destination. The myth of the detached consultant is that when clients believe that the consultant operates like a scientist in a detached, highly objective manner, and he gathers lots of data from the client, goes away and analyzes it, and then, like a computer, computes a highly accurate solution. Then he returns, delivers it to the client, and promptly goes away again. Instead, we've learned that as soon as a consultant begins to interact with a client, she begins to influence that client just by her personality alone. Experienced consultants have learned that they need to fully understand themselves and their effect on their clients. That means understanding their own consulting style, their biases, their unique view on organizations. The myth of the puzzle problem is that consultants and clients often believe that there's only one way to solve their own problem all the time, everywhere. Just like a puzzle. There's one way to solve it, and each piece fits in only one place all the time, everywhere. These clients believe that different consultants would solve their problem in the same exact way. Similar to the myth of the been there and done that consultant, clients who believe this myth might try to find a consultant who solved the exact same puzzle before. The truth is that there are often multiple solutions to a problem. Organizations and the people in them are very dynamic systems, and each organization is unique, depending on the nature of its environment, its culture, its products and services, and its leadership, its age, and its size. When solving a complex problem or achieving a major goal, the consultant and client must carefully examine each solution and select the one that best suits the nature and the needs for today. Finally, there's the myth of the final project plan. And clients who have not worked with consultants before often believe that the consultant's originally proposed plan should never change during the project. These clients might even believe that if the plan has to be changed, then the consultant or even the client have failed somehow. After more experience with consultants, these clients learn that project plans are just the consultant's best judgment for now, until he learns much more about the client's situation. They've learned that it's often best later on to change the plan to address what they've learned about what is really going on in the client's organization. Plans can be changed. Just change them carefully. So I'm going to invite now more time for pause, reflection, and think about which myths might you have? Which do you need to dispel, and among what group of people? You remember we talked about myths like the expertise equals action, the been there, done that consultant, the savior consultant, detached consultant, puzzle problem, and the final project plan. So again, it's very, very important that you get a chance to just pause and reflect carefully on what it was that we talked about. I thank you for coming along with me on this journey. I hope that this information about methods and myths was useful to you. If you have any questions, you can simply send email to info@Consultants Development Institute.